LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation, The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Well, as we approach the warmest October day in many, many years, perhaps it's timely that the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, part of the United Nations, overnight issue a report, Final Call to Save the World from Climate Catastrophe. And they tell us that we are on course to go way above their previously predicted rise of 1.5 degrees C. In fact, we're heading for 3 degrees C, and that will lead to disaster. It'll lead to poverty for hundreds of millions. It'll lead to rising sea levels, and some nations, some islands in particular, being threatened. And we have to act, and we haven't got long to act. In fact, unless we can reverse this trend within the next 12 years, by 2030, we are headed for catastrophe. And they've recommended some steps that need to be taken. We have to reduce CO2, according to the IPCC, by 45% by 2030. Renewables need to provide 80% of our electricity by 2050. Coal needs to be reduced to zero usage. And we need to put an area the size of Australia into crops that we can use to produce energy, and we have to aim for global net zero emissions by 2050. Is this an expensive thing to do? Oh yes, it certainly is. The IPCC estimate it will cost around $2.4 trillion. That's about the size of the UK's gross domestic product every year to achieve these goals. So what do we think of all of this? Well, let me, before I ask you what you think, just give you a few thoughts as to why I am ever so slightly sceptical about some of this. You see, back in 1989, we got a prediction from the UN that entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth if global warming was not reversed by the year 2000. And in February 2008, I sat in the front row of an audience at which Prince Charles was the main speaker. This took place in the European Parliament, and Charles explained that the doomsday clock was ticking, that midnight was now approaching very, very fast indeed, that he thought that the North Pole would be gone completely within the next 7 years, and he urged more power for the European Union in order to deal with this problem. Of course, he got the most whopping standing ovation from people in the room, apart from me. And I sat there with my arms crossed, because I thought, well, even if he's right about what's happening to the climate, although I thought it was somewhat alarmist in terms of the terms he put it, even if he was right, I didn't think arguing we should give away our democratic rights to make decisions was the right way of approaching this. You may well ask, what is the IPCC? Well, set up under the United Nations over 20 years ago, and their brief is they are dedicated to a task of providing us with an objective scientific view of climate change and its political and economic impacts. So just have a think about that. Of climate change and its political and economic impacts. So the point here is, it's quite difficult to see the IPCC actually as being neutral, because they were set up to prove what the impacts of it would be on the economy and on politics. They'd taken it as a given. And the final reason why I'm a little bit sceptical about some of this goes back to a chap called Tony Blair, who, when the Climate Change Act was going through the House of Commons, told us the science is settled. Well, the truth is, there's no such thing as science being settled. All scientific theory are up for grabs, and whether it's Darwin's theory on evolution, they are thought about by scientists and questioned every single year. I am not saying, folks, that global warming isn't happening. But I am saying I think they're way too alarmist in terms of what we're told, and that in many cases this has been used as an excuse to transfer power from voters, nation states, to higher global authorities. So let me ask you, how much does climate change concern you? If it's actually vital and it's way up your agenda and you're doing your bit to save the planet, then tell me why on 0345 6060 973. If, like me, you think some of this language is a little bit alarmist, then please text to 84850 and tell me, do you think government and business are doing their bit to be green or not? And you can tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. We're not live streaming tonight. I'm out of location here in France. But you can comment on Facebook and we'll put some clips out later. So tell me, how much does climate change concern you, given what the IPCC have said overnight, that we are headed for catastrophe unless we can turn this round in the course of the next 12 years. Daniel is calling from Prestatyn and is a new caller to this show. Good evening, Daniel.
Good evening, Nige.
So, how concerned are you?
Quite concerned, basically.
Right.
I mean, I understand what you're saying. We don't know what's going to happen. We will only know in 30 or 40 years' time. But a lot of very intelligent people are telling us that it could be potentially very, very bad. Now, as I said, I understand you're not decided on that sort of stuff. But what if I said we could make changes to our life that don't really affect our lifestyle, make us more efficient, mean that we use less energy, less fuel? What would you say to that?
I wouldn't object one single little bit, Daniel. I really, really wouldn't.
Fantastic.
In fact, I was told about 15 years ago with the government that diesel was a much, much better alternative to petrol, and that it was much more environmentally friendly. So I changed cars from a petrol-fueled injected one to a diesel car. And, I got about 45% more per gallon driving that diesel, only to be told 10 years later, oh, sorry, chaps, we got it wrong. Actually, it's even more damaging to the environment. Do you understand why, Daniel, I'm slightly sceptical? But look, in terms of your overall message of insulating houses, being efficient, yes. And you know something? I'm all for renewable energy if we can do it without taxpayer subsidy.
Fantastic. I mean, you've actually said something I wanted to hit on as well, which is I drive a diesel car. A bit of a disclaimer, I actually work for a car company. I'm not going to mention which one.
Sure.
And I know that diesels are, at the moment, actually a greener car for the environment.
Do you believe that, Daniel?
I do, definitely. I know for a fact. I have colleagues that work in our emissions testing department, and they can state that as a fact. And I think it's a pity that Dieselgate happened, and people have all of a sudden been given this false picture about diesel. Now, don't get me wrong, petrol, diesel, neither is good for the environment. But diesel is the least worst option for a lot of people. If you do long miles,
So see, Daniel, really, you're a bit of a government skeptic too now, aren't you? Because they're telling us the opposite. Daniel, what do you think we should do in response to this IPCC report? Do you think we should take absolutely drastic action? And when you bear in mind, Daniel, and this is worth thinking about, that the United Kingdom's output of carbon dioxide globally is about 2% of what the world produces. I mean, frankly, compared to China, which is mining coal on a scale you and I can't even get our heads round, China, India building coal-fired power stations every week, isn't the truth of this that it's the big population countries that are the only ones that can have any real impact at all?
I think everybody needs to make sacrifices. Yes, you are right. If the big countries, the USA, China, India, Russia, don't make changes, then yes, our sacrifices might be for nothing. But I don't think that's a good enough argument to do nothing.
Okay, all right. No, Daniel, listen, I'm all for doing something. I'm all for the efficiencies you've talked about. I agree with you. I thank you for your call. And very interesting point of view from Daniel there, who works in the motor trade. He genuinely believes that diesel actually is better for the environment. Very interesting. Barry is calling from Brentford, another new caller to the show. Welcome, Barry.
Nigel, a pleasure to speak to you.
Pleasure to speak
it's
to you.
Project Fear again, isn't it? All over again, basically, because carbon dioxide's got nothing to do with the climate of the Earth. It's to do with the sun and how far away we are from the sun. And it's like every 20,000 years there's an ice age, and we're due for one in the next 2,000 years. Greenhouse gases, which is about 1% of the atmosphere, most of that is water vapor, about 97%. So about 3% is carbon dioxide. And most of that 3% comes from natural sources like rotting vegetation, volcanoes, comes out of the sea.
Yes, I mean, isn't it right, Barry, that one major volcanic eruption puts more CO2 into the atmosphere than man does every decade?
Exactly, yeah. And, we should count ourselves lucky that we're living in quite a warm period of the Earth's climatic cycle. because it's a mathematical certainty that the Earth will be in an ice age in the next 2,000 years.
But Barry in Brentford, tell me something. How can you in Brentford be right, and all of these hundreds and thousands of scientists who are signed up with the United Nations IPCC be wrong?
Well, I'll tell you, because they have their own agenda, and they're all funded by governments. So, of course, they're going to put out the government line, so they get their funds for research and everything, and they I forgot what I was going to say now.
You were doing well. You were doing really well. But no, I get your point. I mean, my view is the IPCC was set up to prove the impact of something on the basis that they accepted already that it was happening. And Barry, I'll finish off with this point on you. You talked about the sun. I remember sitting down having lunch in 2000 with the late Sir Patrick Moore, one of the nation's favourite eccentrics and, of course, scientist and widely respected astronomer. And I asked Patrick about this question on climate change. What did he think? And he said, Barry, in line with you, sunspot activity has a bigger effect on the climate of the globe than anything man so far has ever done to it. Barry, I thank you very much indeed for your call. Andrew says by text, if the government agree to the idea of climate change, how can they justify a third runway at Heathrow Airport? Well, Andrew, that's a very good question. Terry says, who's going to tell China to shut their coal-fired power stations? Theresa May? Don't make me laugh. And Michael says, make solar panels compulsory for every new build home. We have plenty of sea all around us. Hydropower should be relatively easy to do. These are simple and easy steps to take. I've got no objection at all, Michael, to solar panels and local generation of hot water. What I object to, Michael, what I object to everybody is this lunacy that Mr. Blair and Cameron were in love with, and that Mr. Corbyn wants to accelerate, which is building these pig-ugly wind farms all over our country, putting up the price of electricity for ordinary families and businesses by 20%. And the beneficiaries are the rich landowners, people like David Cameron's father-in-law, who's paid £1,000 a day just to put these ugly things on their land. It's led to one of the biggest transferences of money from the poor to rich in our country that we've ever seen, and frankly it's of hugely questionable benefit, because when the wind doesn't blow they have to be backed up by gas or something else. So look, I'm not against renewables, but I'm not for it if it involves government subsidy and it involves the poor in society having to pay for it all. That's what I will say I believe in very strongly. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's now 6:15. The International Panel on Climate Change tell us we are headed for catastrophe unless within the next 12 years we reduce CO2 emissions by 45%. If we don't do that, the world's temperature will increase by 3 degrees C, not 1.5 degrees C. And I am a little sceptical about this alarmism, because in 1989, they issued a report telling us that entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth if we hadn't dealt with the problem by the year 2000. I am not saying, because I don't know, whether carbon dioxide is leading to global warming or not. I am convinced by the argument that the sun does have an even bigger impact on the earth, but I'm not saying this isn't happening. But I do not like this being used as an excuse to take away our democratic rights and to build globalist structures. So tell me, I am not that concerned about this report. Maybe you are. Either way, let me know. 0345 6060 973. And a quick story on the background of all of this, which I owe to veteran journalist Christopher Booker, who in 2015 wrote a story about a man who just died. His name was Maurice Strong, a Canadian socialist multimillionaire, a man who made a lot of money out of the oil industry and had some very, very serious concern about it. He was a passionate advocate of one world government. There's quite a common theme that runs through some of this. And it was him, back in 1972, that set up the United Nations Environment Programme, which of course led on to the foundation of the IPCC, said by some to be the man who invented the phrase global warming, and it's happening, of course, at a UN level, and he wanted one world government. Prince Charles wanted more power for the European Union, and this is one of the aspects of it that really, really worries me. I'm not saying global warming isn't happening, but I am saying I'm very concerned about our political responses to it, and I'm very concerned about wind turbines making the rich richer and the poor poorer. Let's go to Toby in Cranfield, a new caller to the show. Good evening, Toby.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I am well. So tell me, how concerned should we be? Are the IPCC right?
I am quite concerned, as is my partner. So as I was saying to your research, we made the conscious effort to reduce our meat intake. So we've gone vegetarian. She's a lot better at it than I am. But you'll be pleased to know that if we do buy meat, we buy meat from UK farms, so that we're reducing our footprint in that way, and also helping UK farmers. We tend not to eat beef whatsoever because it's one of the sort of more polluting animals. And the other thing we've decided to do is, if we are going to have children, we're only going to have one, and we may not have children at all, as a way of reducing our impact on the world.
That's interesting, Toby, because I get Chris here by text says to me, and he's absolutely bang on the money. He says it's definitely caused by too many people. The planet can only sustain 1 to 2 billion. I think, Chris, when I was born, the planet was about 3 billion people. It's now about 7.4 billion people. So overpopulation is the biggest problem here, isn't it? Absolutely, yeah. I think I agree with you, and the sum being around about the 3 billion mark where it's sustainable. Yeah, 7 million is too much, and I remember when it was 6 billion or so, and I thought that was too much. Yes. And do you, Toby, you're concerned, you've changed your lifestyle because of it, probably in a much healthier way, actually, from the sense of it. No, but that's probably a benefit of thinking that way. But do you understand my objection to this argument being used to give more power to the United Nations, more power to the European Union? I really worry that they try and scare us as much as they can with alarmist predictions to take away our democratic choices. I see where your fears come from, but if I might counterject and say that rather than thinking of this as a problem where we will lose powers, think of it more as a team-building exercise where the nations of the world can come together and really focus on what is essentially a global issue that is going to affect everyone, no matter what class you come from, if you're poor, rich, man, woman, whatever. Like this is going to affect everyone, and if we don't deal with it now, we're going to have some serious problems on our hands going forwards with either a lack of food or, in terms of migration. If you don't like economic migrants, wait until you've seen environmental migrants, where they come from countries where they can no longer live because of the lack of water or the lack of food. But conversely, if this is true, there'd be large parts of Siberia that suddenly could be used for producing all sorts of food for them. It could cut both ways, couldn't it? It could. I agree with that. But, if they're going to go to Siberia, and there are any sort of future wars over oils or over certain lands, for example, which side of the table they're going to fall on, do you think? I don't know, Toby. I understand your concern on it. I don't agree with you that we should pull this responsibility up to higher levels. I really don't. I've been fighting against it all my life, but I absolutely get the sincerity with which you believe this and with which you act. Tony says by text, Nigel, here in the southeast of Kent, we have found that most rivers have risen by 1 metre in the past 11 years. There's your evidence. Are you seriously telling me that the Medway and places like that, the Rother, that these rivers are 1 metre higher than they were 11 years ago? Tony, don't believe you, but if you get some evidence, please call 0345 6060 973, because I'm very keen to hear this. Sandra says, funny how you missed out the US in your list of countries who have high CO2 emissions. They're the second highest one. Yes, and their CO2 emissions actually have stopped going up at as high a rate as those of China. But, Sandra, the point I'm making is, and by the way, America is an industrialized country, but it's a relatively small country of 300 million people. There are 1.4 billion Chinese. There are 1.2 billion, I think it now is, Indians. That was the point that I was actually trying to make. Spencer is calling from High Wycombe, and yet another new caller to this show. Spencer, good evening. Good evening. Great to be on the show. I kind of look at it and I say, what would Trump do? If Trump really believed that climate change was a problem to his country, what would Trump do? And I think Trump would look at China and he would say, you're burning cheap coal and exporting your products to us while we're investing billions into renewable energy so that we don't damage the planet. So I think Trump would slap on a massive trade barrier, a trade tariff on Chinese goods. Well, reflecting the fact that they're dumping their products. Under Trump, actually, quite a few Quite a few coal mines that were closed have reopened under Trump. And Spencer, on the point of coal, and folks, listen to this, because I wonder how many of you realise this. They're talking about zero coal usage, the IPCC, within the next 30 years or so. At the moment, globally, 30% of all our energy requirements, our electricity requirements, come from coal. So coal is still a massive source. And Spencer, here's an idea for you. Here's an idea for everybody. If we're serious about reducing CO2 emissions, why don't we start investing in nuclear power in a big way?
I would agree with that. Absolutely. I've analysed nuclear power plants and I've analysed coal plants, and I would go with the nuclear, because coal is much more destructive to the environment, and nuclear doesn't produce any CO2, if that turns out to be a big issue.
No, that's right. And of course, there are risks with nuclear, and we do know that. But I'm always amazed that those that shout the loudest about alarmism on the environment are those who also appear to be most against nuclear power. Spencer, I thank you. Rushing on to Tom in Bishop Stortford. New caller. Good evening, Tom.
Good evening, Nigel. I'm sort of diametrically opposed to your opinion on this.
Okay, well, Tom, you're on LBC. The floor is yours. You tell us why. We don't know. I'm being serious. You tell us why. And by the way, Tom, But by the way, Tom, it's LBC's 45th birthday today. How about that? The first proper commercial radio station in the country. So there we go. And I've been listening since 1978, so I'm used to hearing lots of opinions. Tom, you've got 1.5 minutes to tell us why the IPCC are right and we should be alarmed.
First of all, I mean, you're looking at sovereignty of Britain breaking away from the EU, and then you want to try and control China by saying to them you shouldn't build coal-fired power stations. Well, if they want to be a sovereign nation, they're going to do what the hell they like. And that's the problem. We must lead to a global type of government eventually, because there will be so many different nations that will be doing their own thing that will affect all of the other nations. If you go back 100 years, 200 years, 150 years, people were saying, well, you can keep throwing rubbish in the Thames, it will never be polluted. It eventually became polluted. If you took your house and you hermetically sealed it and you put in 7 billion ants in there that could industrialise what they did and produce carbon, it would eventually have an effect on the atmosphere in that property. And we're no different. We are in a sphere that is sealed, and we are the only species on the planet that can materially affect what goes on the planet. So we can affect the atmosphere by what we actually do, because we burn products, we produce things, we change things genetically. So clearly, we must have an impact. And therefore, and the problem is, we continue to do
Tom, okay. But don't trees take in CO2? Isn't there a chemical process there? Isn't CO2 all around us? Don't market gardeners pump CO2 into the cages to make tomatoes grow better? I mean, Tom, I'll tell you this, I once voted Green, all right? Back in 1989, I regarded myself very much as an environmentalist. They were, in those days, a very Eurosceptic party as well. I care about this stuff, but is CO2 itself really the great demon it's painted out to be?
Well, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to change my lifestyle until, people in the States drive smaller cars, and when you drive around the Docklands at 12 o'clock at night, they turn off all the lights. Pointless me.
All right, no fair dues. Tom, we're out of time. I've given you a fair run. I understand you believe in this passionately, as people do. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show here on LBC at 6:30. Climate catastrophe will be upon us if, within the next 12 years, we don't reduce CO2 emissions by 45%. So we're told overnight by the IPCC, part of the United Nations. Tell me, are you concerned about this? Do you really think we've got to act and act fast? Or, like me, without saying whether it is or isn't happening, are you concerned about the sheer alarmism of the language and the way they want to use it to get more power? Before going back to that and talking of power, European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker was on the stage today mimicking Theresa May by doing a dance just like she did to Dancing Queen at the Tory party conference. Go to lbc.co.uk and you can see Jean-Claude Juncker doing his mock dance. And I suppose, in a way, he was mocking the UK Prime Minister. And I'm supposed, as a Eurosceptic, to be outraged that they're treating our Prime Minister like this, but actually, He did it with a smile. It was pretty amusing. It wasn't some of the nasty, horrid bullying stuff we have seen from the EU negotiators. Personally, I'm not outraged. I think it's rather funny. Also worth mentioning on Brexit that the Prime Minister's spokesman has said today that we're very, very close here, but warned that no withdrawal agreement can be agreed without precise political declarations on the framework of post-Brexit relations. So we're on the verge of agreeing how we leave. We're on the verge of handing over 39, or promising to hand over 39 billion in cash, but we need a precise political declaration in return. I don't know about you. I think if I was going to hand over £39 billion of somebody else's money, I might want a little bit more than a precise political declaration. Hey, and the Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, has said that it would welcome the United Kingdom with open arms into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Well, I certainly think people in this country would want free trade with Japan. Would we want to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Don't know. Donald Trump, of course, withdrew his country from it on the basis that he thought it was too political. But when it comes to options post-Brexit, there are plenty of them. John sarcastically says here, let's slow down the traffic in London to a crawl to allow for cyclists to use them twice a day, making journey times longer. Yes, and John, all those cycle lanes put in for environmental reasons, actually, the traffic going at the pace that it is increasing pollution. Another John takes the view that I do on sovereignty to some extent. He says they want to start a global tax that then leads to global government. The EU is a prototype and it worked. I say no thanks. Well, whether the EU is whether it's working is perhaps open to question. Back to the callers, and every single one of you so far is a new caller to this show, and you're all very welcome. Whatever your view, we can have a polite conversation either way. Claire in Brentwood, hello.
Hello, it's a pleasure to speak to you, Nigel, first of all. Secondly, I'm not afraid at all of what they're going on about. I think they fearmonger all the time, not just about climate, but about all sorts of things. I'm not in doubt, I don't think that many people can be, that the climate is changing, although that seems to be a very sort of vague statement, But anyway, I just don't think that people can actually do anything about it. I think that the climate is, on a cycle. The world has been around for hundreds of millions of years. I just think that it's going to happen. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. I think it's ironic that the people from Greenpeace are scaling this building. I forget where it was, but one of the founders of Greenpeace, I think his name is Patrick Moore, completely disagrees with everything that they are now saying, which I just think is quite interesting. He doesn't believe, in fact, that all this stuff that they're saying is true. And thirdly, my dad says to me, I'm nearly 40. My dad says to me, he says, when I was younger, it was all going to be an ice age. And then a bit after that, it's global warming.
Yes.
Then it's not warm anymore. Oh, maybe. Oh, it's climate change. And then they just change their mind every 5 minutes.
Claire, I saw Blue Peter in 1972, and on Blue Peter they told me a new ice age was coming, and I was about 8. I was really, really frightened by it. And your point about climate change and the climate always changing, when the Danes discovered what we now know as Greenland, why do you think it was called Greenland? Because there wasn't any ice on it.
This fella that was one of the founders of Greenpeace, he says that people were came about in a tropical climate. In the Sahara Desert, it was lush. There was camels and that found in Canada. So we have been different. The world has looked different than what it does now.
No, absolutely. We also, Claire, in the 18th century, of course, had these big winters where there were fairs on the Thames and where an elephant walked across the Thames just under Blackfriars Bridge. So the climate has always been changing. And Claire, so you're not concerned in the least about this?
No. What concerns me the most is the government, because worse than all of that is they come out with, it's my fault, it's your fault, or you should drive less, right? Instead of actually saying, well, we're so worried we're going to stop importing, bananas or pineapples or whatever from Africa, because really we don't need to eat them and it's just wasting fuel and whatever. Or every house that gets built needs to have solar panels or whatever. They don't want to do any of that. They just want to blame me and you, or put up our fuel prices, or make sure that we have wind farms everywhere, or whatever it is the idea they want at the time. Instead of actually, honestly, I think that if they were really serious about it, they would really come out with some serious stuff, but they don't. And that's what makes me believe that they're not really that bothered about it at all. This is just,
Okay.
you know.
No, Claire, you are a proper sceptic, I thank you. Jat says to me by Twitter, I'd like to hear what the young have to say about global warming. It's their future, just like Brexit. But I can't see them protesting about carbon emissions in the same way. Can you? No, and yet, Jat, believe you me, the young have been taught through our education system that this is absolutely a fact, and that anyone that questions it is called a denier. And I remember being on a BBC debate with Michael Cashman, the former EastEnders star. He was a Labour MEP. He now sits in the House of Lords. Perfect, nice chap. I get on rather well with him. But I, sort of about 10 years ago, I asked a question about this, where we really do it. And, you know, he went puce in the face. He stood up. He pointed at me. He screamed, denier, denier, as if I'd sort of committed some terrible sin. And to even question global warming, you know, it's rather like the Salem witch trials. So, Jack, that's my feeling, is the young overwhelmingly believe this to be true because they've been taught that it is true. And it may well be true. I'm not saying, folks, it's not true. It's how we're handling it that I really object to. Nigel, take a look and see how many times the Thames Barrier has increased in activities through its working life. Well, Tony, with or without global warming, I think it's true to say that the east of England is gradually sinking and the west of England is gradually rising. But please, any big geologists or experts on tectonic plates, do call 0345 6060 973 and say I'm talking rubbish. Let's go to Crouch End and speak to Angus, another new caller to this show. Good evening, Angus.
Good evening, Nigel.
Welcome.
Well,
so, how concerned
what I've
are
done
you?
is I had a car about 3 years ago, and I'd always had a car, you know, since I was in my 20s or whatever. I'm in my early 50s now, and I found it was sitting outside my house. I was paying for residence parking, wasn't using it very much. And the main thing I needed it for was I'm a semi-pro bass player, and I needed to lug my gear around to gigs sometimes. So I researched that. I found out through researching that you can get lightweight speakers and amps and stuff nowadays. So that really gave me no reason to keep the car. So I thought, I'm going to experiment with getting rid of the car. So I got rid of the car. So I haven't had a car for it'll be 3 years at the end of next January. And I really haven't missed it. There's a car club almost outside my house, which I haven't even needed to use, you know, where you can rent them by the hour. I haven't even needed that. I've got an overground station nearby. I've got a tube station 10 minutes walk away. Haven't needed it.
So do you feel, Angus, by getting rid of your car that you've kind of done your bit?
I could do more. I mean, I haven't flown that much recently. I'm sure I could do more. I'm sort of veggie-ish. I eat fish, but I don't eat meat. I'm sure there's more things I could do, but I think if one tries to, you know, if you try to do your bit, then you at least not being hypocritical.
So,
I mean, waiting for people in America.
So you think morally, Angus? Do you think morally we all ought to do a bit more?
I don't know. I think it would be a good idea. Well, the one point I was going to make is that, you know, even if the science is not completely accurate, if you live in London and there's all these people dying from respiratory diseases from all the pollution, surely it's a good idea to get rid of your car anyway.
Angus, I am against pollution. It's why I was once a greenie. It's why I once regarded myself as an environmentalist, and I worry we focus so much on CO2, we may have ignored many other things that are doing the environment serious harm. I think some of the Volkswagen emissions tests were made to meet CO2 standards, and hey, they turned a blind eye to the other stuff, and that worries me. Now, Christian sends me a text that's complete rubbish. He says the world is overpopulated. It's a myth. The entire world's population can fit into the state of Texas. We'll reach 11 billion, and it will stay at that. Christian, are you seriously saying if we put 7 billion people in Texas, we'd have the water, the food, the resources to look after them? That is utter nonsense. There are too many people in the world, and that is a bigger problem for the world, I suspect, than CO2 emissions on their own. One does, of course, lead to the other. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC at 6:45. How big a threat is climate change? Let me know. 0345 6060 973. Brad says to me, in my opinion, there is a major threat to the planet, and it's called plastic. Brad, I'm with you. There's way too much plastic in our seas. It's horrendous. Richard says, when Hollywood stars like Leonardo DiCaprio fly around on private jets to lecture us on climate change, be sceptical. Richard, I'm with you. I'm off to Chessington in Surrey to speak to Paul, who's a new caller to this show. Paul, good evening.
Hi, Nigel. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right, but I just, you know, I've heard all this alarmism before. I'm not saying it's not an issue, but they really are trying to terrify us into giving them lots and lots of power.
Well, I was driving home tonight, Nigel, about 30 minutes ago, and I just picked up on obviously on your programme, which I listen to almost every evening when I'm driving home.
Yep.
And you mentioned about renewable energy, which I have a vested interest. I have it's not a big company, it's a small company. We specialise in solar PV. And
yes,
it's good technology. It does work. Introduced into this country maybe about 5-6 years ago, I think, by the Labour government. The FIT tariffs at that time were set a bit high. Didn't really know what they were doing. It's now
funny that.
Yeah.
Sorry to put you off.
April next year, Nigel. But the FIT tariff started off at about 45p per every kilowatt hour you produced, which was too high. Anyway, it kind of levelled out. Great industry, lots of people were benefiting from it. So was the climate. It's now down to 4p per kilowatt hour. So lots of people are put off by that. And guess what? April next year, no more feed-in tariffs. So
yes.
The majority of people that would buy this technology are now not going to bother because it's too rich for them, although they want to buy it. I see many customers, it's too rich for them.
Well, I'm sorry, Paul, but I believe, the market, technology moves to suit the market. And I think once we get rid of subsidy, it'll make science move more quickly. And I do think that a solar panel on the side of your roof, helping you, produce your own local hot water or whatever, makes perfect sense to me. I'm not burying my head in the sand on this stuff. But do you understand, Paul, why people like me object to taxpayer subsidy, and not so much your industry, but this wind industry, where these rich landowners get paid fortunes?
Nigel, you're not putting the two and two together. The wind industry is totally different to the solar PV industry.
No, I get that. I was talking in I was talking in general terms about renewable energy. But Paul, when that feed-in tariff goes, what will happen to your business, in your opinion?
Well, you did actually mention the point that which prompted me to call you guys.
Yeah,
was that, in your opinion, some form of renewable technology should be put on every new build? In fact, that's our business now, because domestic-wise, we don't support the domestic market anymore because it's too rich for people. But our main business now is commercial, where there's high energy usage, and new build, because in the southeast of England and in London, that's our demographic where we work, to get through planning, you must put X amount, you must give a percentage back, 10-20% of the CO2 you're going to produce, which equates into a kilowatt output for solar usage. So our business now is, to say what you were saying earlier, is actually new build. And I totally agree with that. You should.
Okay.
You should be doing that.
Paul, I'm not against us making long-term solutions. I want to get rid of subsidy. Thank you very much indeed for your call. Mark says to me, so Nigel, you think it's okay to tell climate scientists how to do their job? No, I don't. So you are so qualified in similar scientific disciplines, are you, as a politician? Mark, I haven't said any of that. I've said maybe it is happening, but I object to the alarmist language. I've heard it time and again. I'm tired of being taxed on it so that the rich can get richer, and I don't want to lose our democratic powers to the United Nations, the European Union, or anybody else. Jeanette says 97% of climate scientists agree. Well, maybe they do, Jeanette, but a lot of them are being paid to agree, which is a point we have made on this show. And Ivan says, Nigel, we should plant more trees to reduce CO2. Why aren't you working on that? Ivan, I agree with you. I think what is happening, particularly with the Amazon, with very, very large amounts of it being cut down for beef cattle production and things like that, is something that we should be genuinely worried about. As I say, I regard myself in some ways as an environmentalist. Let us go to Andy in Lancaster, yet another new caller to this show. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Nigel. How are you?
I am well. So how alarmed are you in Lancaster about this?
Good luck. Well, I was just going to refer to what one of your earlier callers said and yourself about him giving up his car and trying to do his bit and being, buying into some of the green agenda, which is absolutely fine. And it was quite refreshing, to be candid, to hear him speaking as he did and not, in a bullying or holier than thou sanctimonious tone. It was, quite nice.
Absolutely, because I asked him, didn't I, Andy? Did he think morally we should all follow his example? And he wasn't sanctimonious in the least. I agree with you.
Absolutely not. No, he seemed very reasoned and said, he was doing his bit. I agree. I like to do my bit with my plastic recycling. I think, like you, plastic is a really horrible material that should be dealt with in a more efficient and responsible way. I will say, unlike him, I am not going to give up my motor car. I live in a very rural area. I have worked in the motor trade for 35 years. I picked up on what you said earlier about you having a diesel car and, buying into the, dare we call it, propaganda led march that was diesel 25 years ago, whenever it was.
So if they're wrong on diesel, Andy, if they're wrong on diesel, they can be wrong on other things too, can't they?
Oh, look, absolutely, without a doubt, and only time and a look back in history will prove that correct. But I fundamentally believe that it is all about, yes, the environmental issues are a convenient sideline with which to distract from the main headline flashing in lights event, which should be revenue. They are taking us for a ride. They will take us for a ride, whether it be petrol, diesel. Believe me, if we're concerned now about revenue on tax, which is something like 80%.
Of our total with direct, indirect. Yeah, no, Andy, I agree with you. They will use it to tax us. They will use it to take away our democratic powers. I'm going to let you go because I want to squeeze in Paul from Glastonbury as our last caller on this subject. And, Paul, you complete a full house of new callers this evening. Welcome.
Good evening, Nigel. How you doing? We're down here in deepest, darkest Somerset with my pet pig, Trigger. Now, he'll tell you about climate change. I tell you what, this is true. I kid you not, Nigel. Yeah. Right, there you go. He nearly took my hand off.
Well, that's a first.
Well,
I can. Right.
I've travelled the world. I've got sustainable farming here. I'm on all the groups and that for Mendip and all the way around. We've got one hell of a problem. I tell you what, I've got this farm here. I've got 100 acres here. I've got, like, down in Bridgewater, it's 45. I got about 230 acres all the way around. Now, it's never been sprayed, never been fertilised. The whole of these orchards, the whole of this, we've lost over 80%, nearly 90% of all our wildlife, our insects, our birds. We're terrified. Where's it all gone? I'll tell you what, another thing. We've got
Paul. Is this use of pesticides and things like that?
I would say I'm radio away from your phones because there's a lot of chappies telling me when they were putting these Texamax in and all the rest of it, you switched them on, watched all the insects dying around them.
Paul, I'm running out of time. Very quickly, do you believe the IPCC that if we don't reduce CO2 by 45%, there'll be a global catastrophe?
Yeah, and I tell you what, I take the green licence away from Glastonbury Festival because Greenpeace, they get a lot of money there.
All right, OK, Paul, I've got to go. I'd love to speak to you forever. I'm back tomorrow at 6. At 10 tonight, it's Tom Swarbrick. Up next, it's Ian Dale.
Nigel, thank you very much.